Imagine waking up one morning, picking up your rifle and heading into the jungle. Not because you're crazy, but because nobody told you the war was over. That's exactly what happened to one man. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and his story is perhaps the most extraordinary tale of loyalty, isolation, and survival the modern world has ever witnessed.
And what makes this story even more haunting is that this wasn't a few weeks or months of confusion. We're talking about nearly 30 years, Alex. 30 years of fighting a war that had already ended. While the world moved on, rebuilt cities, signed peace treaties, sent men to the moon, this soldier was still deep in the Philippine jungle, convinced that his mission was ongoing.
Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Kamekawa, Japan. From an early age, he was shaped by the fierce samurai code of Bushido, a philosophy that placed honor, loyalty, and duty above everything, including life itself. Surrender, in his world, wasn't just defeat, it was the ultimate shame. It was something a true soldier simply did not do.
He joined the Imperial Japanese Army in 1940 at the age of 18. But what set Onoda apart from ordinary soldiers was his exceptional intelligence and strategic mind. He was hand-picked and sent to the Nakano School, a secret military academy that trained elite guerrilla warfare specialists. These weren't regular soldiers. They were taught to think independently, survive behind enemy lines, and carry out missions even without communication from headquarters.
And that training would define the rest of his life in ways nobody could predicted. In December 1944, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders were chillingly clear and absolute. Hold the island, disrupt enemy operations, and under no circumstances surrender or take your own life. He was told that no matter how long it took, months, years, help would eventually come.
Those words, "help will come," became the anchor of his existence for the next 30 years. When Japanese forces on the island were defeated in early 1945, most soldiers surrendered or were killed, but Onoda and a small group of men retreated deep into the jungle. They had their orders. They would wait.
And wait he did. As months turned into years, his small group began receiving scattered information, leaflets dropped from planes, newspapers left in the jungle, all claiming the war had ended. But Onoda had been trained to expect exactly this kind of psychological warfare. In his mind, these were enemy tricks designed to lure him out of hiding.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The very training that made him exceptional also made it nearly impossible for him to accept reality. Every piece of evidence that the war was over became, in his mind, further proof of how desperately the enemy wanted him to stop fighting.
One by one, his companions either surrendered or were killed. By the 1970s, Onoda was completely alone in that jungle, and still he fought on. Let's paint a picture of what daily life actually looked like for Hiroo Onoda during those decades in the jungle. Because it's easy to say he survived 30 years, but the reality of what that meant physically and psychologically is almost incomprehensible. Lubang Island isn't a comfortable place. The jungle is dense, humid, and unforgiving. Temperatures are brutal. Disease is everywhere. Food is scarce. And yet, Onoda not only survived, he thrived as a guerrilla fighter.
He and his remaining companions raided local farms for food, sabotaged infrastructure, and engaged in firefights with Filipino police and military units. And this is where the story becomes deeply tragic, because from the perspective of the local Filipino population, Onoda wasn't a lost soldier, he was a dangerous criminal. Over the years, his activities resulted in the deaths of approximately 30 Filipino civilians and soldiers, people who had nothing to do with World War II, living their lives decades after the war ended, were dying because of one man's unshakable conviction. That's the darkest part of this story, Sarah, and it's important we don't romanticize it. Onoda was, by any modern definition, causing real harm to real people. But from inside his reality, the reality he had constructed, or rather the reality he had never been allowed to leave, he was a soldier doing his duty. The Japanese government made multiple attempts to reach him. In 1959, Onoda was officially declared dead in absentia, but the sightings kept coming. Footprints, raided farms, occasional gunfire. Someone was still out there. In 1972, his last remaining companion, Kinshichi Kozuka, was killed in a confrontation with Filipino police. Now Onoda was truly alone, one aging soldier in a jungle fighting a war that the entire world had moved on from. Psychologists who later studied his case described his mental state as a form of extreme cognitive commitment, a psychological phenomenon where a person becomes so deeply invested in a belief system that contradicting evidence is not just rejected, it's reinterpreted to fit the existing worldview. In simple terms, his mind had built walls so strong that the truth simply couldn't get through. Not because he was unintelligent, quite the opposite. His sharp, trained mind had become his own prison.
The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived in the most unexpected way, not through a military operation, not through government diplomacy, but by a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki. Suzuki was 23 years old in 1974, and by all accounts, he was the kind of person who collected impossible challenges the way others collect stamps. He had publicly declared that his life goals included finding Hiroo Onoda, seeing a panda in the wild, and encountering the abominable snowman in that order.
And incredibly, he found Onoda within days of arriving on Lubang Island. Where decades of organized searches had failed, one determined young man with a backpack succeeded. He simply went into the jungle and started looking.
When Suzuki finally made contact, Onoda didn't shoot him. Something about this young, earnest Japanese man made Onoda pause. They talked. Suzuki told him the war was over. Onoda's response was both heartbreaking and completely consistent with everything we know about him. He said he would only stand down if he received direct orders from his commanding officer.
His commanding officer from 1945, a man who by 1974 was in his 70s and living as a quiet civilian in Japan.
Suzuki returned to Japan and tracked down Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now a bookseller living an ordinary life. He explained the situation, and to his enormous credit, Taniguchi agreed immediately to return to the Philippines and personally relieve Onoda of his duty.
On March 9, 1974, in a jungle clearing on Lubang Island, Major Taniguchi stood before his former soldier and read the official orders that had actually been issued in September 1945, nearly 3 decades earlier. The war was over. Lieutenant Onoda was to cease all combat activity immediately.
Onoda later described that moment as the instant his entire world collapsed. He wrote that he stood there and did what a Japanese soldier was trained never to do. He cried.
Imagine stepping out of a jungle in 1974 after 30 years and trying to make sense of the world around you. Japan in 1974 was unrecognizable compared to the country Onoda had left in 1944. The devastation of war had been replaced by one of the greatest economic miracles in human history.
The cities that had been reduced to rubble were now gleaming metropolises. The Japanese people, once mobilized entirely for war, were now building televisions, cars, and cameras that were being sold around the world. Everything Onoda had believed he was fighting to protect, the old Japan, the imperial Japan, no longer existed.
He emerged from the jungle still carrying his rifle, still in his military uniform, still bearing the sword that was a symbol of his officer's rank. He was 52 years old. He had spent more of his adult life in that jungle than outside it.
The reception he received in Japan was extraordinary and complicated in equal measure. He was welcomed as a hero by some, a living symbol of dedication and loyalty pushed to its absolute extreme, but others viewed him with unease, even discomfort, because celebrating Onoda meant grappling with uncomfortable questions about the war itself, about blind obedience, about what loyalty truly means.
The Filipino government initially wanted to prosecute him for the killings that had occurred during the decades. President Ferdinand Marcos ultimately pardoned him, acknowledging that Onoda had simply been following the orders he had been given.
Onoda himself struggled deeply with the reintegration. Modern Japan felt alien to him. The values, the pace, the priorities, everything was different. He spoke publicly about feeling lost in a country that was technically his home, but felt like a foreign land.
Hiroo Onoda eventually left Japan and moved to Brazil, where he raised cattle and built a new life far from the attention and the complicated emotions his presence stirred. He later returned to Japan and established a nature school for young people, teaching wilderness survival skills.
He died in January 2014 at the age of 91, and in his final years, he gave interviews that revealed a man of extraordinary complexity. He never fully apologized for the harm he caused during his decades in the jungle. He maintained that he had done his duty as he understood it.
And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of his story. Not that loyalty is good or bad, not that obedience is virtue or vice, but that the frameworks we are given, the beliefs, the identities, the missions, can become so deeply embedded that they persist long after the world that created them has ceased to exist.
There are Hiroo Onodas in all of us, in smaller ways. Beliefs we hold long after the evidence has changed, fights we keep fighting long after they've been resolved, identities we cling to long after they've stopped serving us.
His story isn't just history, it's a mirror, and what we see in it says as much about us as it does about him.
Hiroo Onoda, the last soldier, a man who never surrendered, not because he couldn't, but because in every way that mattered to him, he simply didn't know how.
Thank you for joining us today. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves history, and we'll see you in the next episode. Until next time.